Beloved Saints, today's 5-minute message of redemptive history is about the relationship between biblical genealogies and the history of redemption, Part 1, from the 5th book of Redemptive History series, The Promise of the Eternal Covenant. Biblical genealogies reveal family relationships and explain important historical truths. However, from the redemptive historical perspective, biblical genealogies are much more significant for many reasons. First, biblical genealogies are summaries and progressive signposts of redemptive history. Biblical history, which begins with the book of Genesis and ends with Revelations, is the history of redemption. The genealogies are summaries of the essence of the mysterious administration in the history of redemption. In the Bible, at each important moment in the history of redemption, a genealogy is recorded to mark that turning point. Genealogies can conclude an era in the history of redemption as well as begin a new one. For example, the book of Genesis is made up of 10 genealogies. The book of Ruth, at its conclusion, introduces a genealogy that starts with Perez and ends with David. First Chronicles, which begins with a genealogy, records within 9 chapters an extensive genealogy spanning from Adam to those who returned from Babylonian captivity. The Gospel of Matthew, which opens the New Testament, also begins with the genealogy. In particular, the genealogy of Jesus Christ summarizes the history of Abraham to Jesus Christ, which are the main points of the entire history of redemption. Because of this, an in-depth study of the genealogy of Jesus Christ will enable us to have a clear grasp of the Christ-centered history of redemption. Moreover, such a study will provide a panoramic view of the overarching thread that runs through the entire history of redemption, which is a history that God has planned before the foundation of the world and has been fulfilling to this day. The various genealogies recorded in the different parts of the Bible also function as progressive signposts in redemptive history. Within the overarching theme called God's history of redemption, the scripture, through its genealogies, provide a progressive revelation of the promise of the Messiah's coming as the seed of the woman. In doing so, the scripture reveals to us that God's revelation of salvation has never ceased throughout the ages, and confirms repeatedly that this promise regarding the Messiah will surely be fulfilled. Thus, biblical genealogies are signposts of redemptive history that instill hope in all mankind. Moreover, they serve as scriptural landmarks that reaffirm the unwavering nature of God's covenant of salvation. Second, biblical genealogies display the succession of covenantal descendants. Biblical genealogies contain omissions and do not necessarily continue the line of descent through the firstborn of the family. This is because biblical genealogies do not merely display the succession of lineal descendants. Rather, biblical genealogies display the succession of descendants that continues the history of redemption through God's covenants. Throughout history, Satan has materialized his terrifying plan to interrupt the succession of covenantal people and thwart God's administration of redemption. Such plans, great and small, surfaced endlessly throughout the redemptive history. The first example was when the Egyptian Pharaoh sought to kill all the male Hebrew babies and enslave the Israelites forever. The second example was when Athaliah, the wife of Judah's king Jehoram and daughter of Israel's king Ahab, sought to annihilate the seed of David. The third example was when Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and the prime minister of Persia during the reign of King Ahasuerus, had planned and attempted a complete massacre of the Jews throughout the Persian Empire. In all of these examples, there were great danger, but God did not allow an interruption in the succession of the covenantal descendants. Beloved saints, the more we study the biblical genealogies, we will clearly understand God's redemptive history and the succession of the covenantal descendants. Today, through biblical genealogies, let us realize God's redemptive history and carry the word of the covenant. Let us all take part in fulfilling God's redemptive history. I bless in the name of the Lord.